Well, how about I start with something and I'll throw it back to you.
Sounds great.
Okay. So how are the levels okay? So I spent about a month of my fall in Moscow, which is a really interesting place right now. I call it an adolescent city. I think in the roaring 90s, it was definitely an infant because sort of anything went in the 90s. And now you see sort of the rise of the middle class, you see the rise of the chain store, but you also see from a design and a kind of urban development perspective, people really reconsidering old spaces that were historical, spaces that might have been condemned, and thinking hard about the question of how do we make these spaces usable creative spaces. And Russia has many things, but one of those things is these kind of huge communist collectivist halls. For instance, there was a constructivist bus depot that was, just, it's like an airplane hangar because everyone took the bus, during the 20th century. And someone had the beautiful idea to turn this into a really top-class modern art museum, and right now it's hosting the twin shows of Maria Abramovich and William Kentridge that was at the MoMA. And the Abramovich show is really interesting. I don't know if anyone got to see that show at the MoMA, but the Abramovich show includes a sort of retrospective of people watching Abramovich at the MoMA. So, but I guess I was in Moscow, and don't get me wrong, in Moscow there's a lot of terrible kitsch. There's a lot of things that have gone disastrously wrong. But I think when you see these places where things have gone right, where people have taken whatever particular space was allotted to them, were able to navigate the horrific sort of red tape of large, which I'm sure you can speak to a little bit, of these large municipal bureaucracies, and created something beautiful, transcendent, something like the High Line, where everyone was sort of grumbling about this and like, oh God, is this gonna, what is this gonna be like? And then you go there and you're like, wow, this feels like it's been always there. I think these moments where all these things come together are incredible, and you don't actually necessarily have to go to Moscow to see them. I think you just had an experience the other night.
Yeah, actually, right before I came here. You're absolutely right. And, the topic, the future of imagination, I'm sure we've spent a lot of time the last few weeks thinking about that. And I realized tonight I was at Grand Central at the sort of previewing of the Apple Store, which opens tomorrow. And it is just amazing, exactly what you're talking about, to see this use of Grand Central. And if you ask me, you're standing there in a space that I know extremely well, that over the last 23 years I've used for our Music Under New York auditions. We've seen it be different things. We now, of course, saw it as a restaurant. And to stand there and see what they've done, which is it appears to be very little. It looks like they really didn't do anything. And yet, if you know that space very well, they have invested to such a degree that the space looks better than I've seen it since I've worked there for 23 years. And I'm excited. I'm excited because it's going to be a place that, how many of you go to Apple stores at least once in a while, And how many of you go to restaurants in Grand Central? I think that it's going to invite the public up into the space that you have a very different view. How many of you spent time in the balconies at Grand Central? It's a remarkable experience to have the ceiling now that for the last 15 or so years we've had it restored, and to stand there and experience the space. And today, standing there, because it's very minimal, it's the typical look, and that's, the designer said, Simon said that his purpose was to make you feel that they did nothing. And it's exactly what they did.
This makes me think, just hearing you talk makes me think of as we do look forward to the kind of history of imagination, and one of the things that I positioned it in is this kind of within the culture of the digital age, right? Where things become increasingly accessible, where we have gadgets that allow us to access things that were not accessible 10, 15 to 1 year ago. This is there's a kind of increasing age of where we have, where those barriers are being shut down, or collapsed, I should say. What is the history? What is the future of innovation compared to what's come before? Because there's these sort of like watershed moments if you look at the history of design, the history of literature, the history of art, where people kind of threw something out that was completely new. I mean, obviously it was in reaction to things before, but if you look at sort of the chatter on the internet, the chatter on in urban design and in everything, it's a lot of it is taking old ideas, old spaces, and somehow making it new. Right. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing or anything less than what happened before, but because there's so much out there, New York City exists, Grand Central exists, 200 million documents exist on the internet. A lot of creativity is taking the form of the reaction. The response. Sort of the most cutting edge music these days is the mashup, where you take two songs and you put it together in a way that is totally new, this kind of resampling. Yeah. And we recognize when we do this in a beautiful way, like perhaps the Apple Store at Grand Central, where suddenly you take what was already there and you make it new.
And you sort of, you give a person, an individual, the opportunity to look at it in a different way, in a new way, which is what I think will happen. When I thinking about imagination, I really knew that if you talk about the subway, which is where most of the art that we've done is predominantly in the subway, Metro North, Grand Central to Long Island Railroad, but the bulk, over 175 projects in the subway. And you look back to the early 80s, I think, Reif, you were a small child then, right? But the early 80s, when I had the good fortune to be part of a team that the leadership, and I was a follower, the leadership believed that you could turn this place around. Now, if you remember the subway in the early 80s, it was on the brink of collapse. It was covered in graffiti. Trains broke down every day. You were lucky if you got to work without your train breaking down. And visionary, they had the imagination to believe you could change this place. Now, of course, people love to hate the MTA, and they love to, there are plenty of things we can improve every day and make it better. But the place that it is now, with Elizabeth Murray, with Saul LeWitt, with Roy Lichtenstein at Times Square, with these works, they're in major museums, but they're in the New York subway. And I remember this, one of the most impressive experiences I had when I first came to the MTA. I was at a public art, I was sent over to a public art conference, and Patricia Phillips, who was and is a well-known writer about public art, made the statement, this was in Boston, and she said, I hear in New York they're going to do public art in the subways. That in itself is the most interesting conceptual artwork itself. And I thought that's right. That's right, that you take a bureaucracy that is used to, whose mission is to move trains, run trains, move people, get you to work, who has got problems every day to tackle. And they have prioritized and truly got that if you want people to care about this space and to know you care about it, you have to humanize it. And so what humanizes? Introducing art.
So I have a sort of personal story about public art in the subway that I hope you won't mind if I...
I'd love to hear it.
Okay. Because I am always interested in this question of like, what is the role of public art in our lives? Is it just something to beautify? Is it something deeper? Both my parents are public, or not public artists, but they're they're artists who have had their work shown in public, and it's a much larger question of why do we make these installations in the places that we work, in the places where we live. And so I was reading Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point.
Tipping Point.
Right. About this very New York subway, where in like sort of the worst point of it, they started prosecuting people for fare hopping or fare jumping. In neighborhoods where there was much worse problems going on. There was there was drugs, there was murders, and everyone was like, why would you prosecute fare jumpers? It's like the least of our problems. And the whole theory was, if you start cleaning up the bottom, if people are getting prosecuted for fare jumping, then people are like, oh, maybe there is a whole system of laws going on here, and you see this effect where the drug dealing goes down and the murder rate goes down. Obviously, it's not as simplistic as that, but little things make huge differences, is the point, in interconnected environments. So I was reading this book, this very line on the Q train from DeKalb over to Chinatown as you go over the bridge, and it's one of my favorite pieces of public art in the whole system, which is this kind of animation that you see as you go out.
Mass transiscope.
Mass transiscope, is that what
Bill
it's called?
Brandt's mass transiscope.
And it's this sort of, I don't know if you've seen it, but you usually see it when you sort of look up and you're not expecting it. And there's this animation that is completely generated by the movement of the train, by the collective movement of all of you who are on the train going to another place. That's all it takes. There's no movie camera. It's your collective effort of going somewhere that's creating this animation. And I looked up and I saw it as I was reading this paragraph, and I must have had a look of awe on my face because I looked over to this woman, very attractive woman, and we had this moment where we were both like, oh my God, like, what a little miracle going on. And I made this kind of implicit connection to this prosecution during the 80s of these fare jumpers, and I was like, no, little things make big differences.
Huge differences. That's Bill Brandt's mass transiscope was done in the early 80s, part of, or even before that, part of with Creative Time. And it was prior to Arts for Transit, but when I came along, and several of us, it was still, I remember the first day I saw it, and I'd been there just a few weeks, and unfortunately, it was graffitied over and was out of commission for very many years. We were able in around 1993, 92 to restore it. And then, of course, it was graffitied over, and for many, many years, and of course the funding was cut on things that were extra, so we weren't able to do anything. And then about 2 years ago, Bill came along, and we had wanted so much, and with Bill and with his students and with some friends, we were able to restore it. Bill actually did the labor, and we were able to put a lock on the door, so it's alive and well. And if you want to see it, you can, of course, take the train, but you can also look at Arts for Transit's website at mta.info, go to Arts for Transit, and we have a video of it there. We actually have a video from when it was originally done. And it's a zoetrope, and you see it.
But don't watch the video, take the train.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing, right?
Yes, but I want you to see it tonight, while it's fresh.
That's I mean, no other artwork embodies the Arts for Transit label as that one, because you need to travel to see it.
That's
right?
true. That's true. It was very interesting you were talking about, it was George Kelling and James Ramsey's philosophy, which was the broken window theory, that if you, for me, I was adopting it at the same time that they were talking, and it was actually Bill Bratton was the chief of police for the MTA, and they were really adopting this sort of philosophy underground. We were working parallel with them, and our mission, not sort of formally, we just happened to be, and they were always talking about you would hear people talk about the broken window theory, and we were working, trying to change this place, this space visually, and by including art, and I always called it the loose thread theory, because I knew if you went through a station, and if you know how that tendency to pull a thread, and if you went through a station that wasn't kept up, that you weren't maintaining it, then people would throw their trash down on the ground. But if you went in and you rebuilt a station, you included art, and you made this place feel as if somebody cared about it, then the people that went through it would care about it. And it was in sync. There was sort of parallel. I said for many, many years that I believe New York turned around because, they always said because of the George Kelling, the philosophy, and New York City Police adopting it. I felt New York turned around because the New York City subway turned around. And it was from literally the bottom up, that if we could change this place, if we could make this place better, and you feel good about traveling through it, then New York could change. And sure enough, it did. So I like to think that that one doesn't, Malcolm Gladwell in The Tipping Point talks about the police and crime. I think he could talk equally about what happened in the subway. Now, I talk about art, but in all honesty, the architects had so much to do with this. The leadership that founded Arts for Transit also said architects need to be designing these spaces. It's great, engineers, it's always been an engineering feat and led by engineers, but for a number of years there, we were able to really let that be a partnership with architects. And so we set up design guidelines. We really made a concerted effort to turn this place around. And I believe, that today, if you look at it, there's so many things we can do better, but there are a number of things that a number of people got right.
I want to shift the conversation a little bit, and it comes off of one of the art pieces, another of the art pieces in the subway that I love. I believe it's by Chris Janney in Herald Square, the sound installation where
Reach.
Where you have to interact with, as you walk through it, it makes noises. And I don't know if you've seen this. My family actually knows Chris Janney because he has another installation at the Boston Museum of Science. If you've ever been to Boston, the Museum of Science is wonderful, but it has this stairwell where as you walk up it makes these sort of marimba-esque sounds. And you'll see people just kind of nursing that stairwell. I mean, they don't even go to the rest of the museum. They just kind of, they're hitting it hard. And it's this one, I think it's one of the great things about public art, which is that there's this interactive element that creates all these stories. Like people will then tell, the craziest things happen at, the Museum of Science. I was drumming on the stairs, and to me, I think more than a writer, I'm interested in storytelling, and particularly as we stand on this precipice of like, what is the future of creativity? What is the future of imagination? What's the future of media? The question mark of how will storytelling stay or change as we move to a media that actually, people are more and more accustomed to being able to interact with things, right? The setup of a web page is inherently interactive, and you're seeing video games become more and more like movies. The sort of hot video game of the season right now is called Uncharted 3, and I don't know the full story, but it had a huge budget. All the actors were hired, and basically what people are saying is, this does the action movie much better than Hollywood does their own action movies. And like, how can that be? And you have limited sort of interaction. It's sort of a linear storyline, but at the key moments where the plane's crashing and you're hanging off the back, you're controlling the guy, And I see us going in that direction, and it's almost like movies are going to be, there's going to be an expectation for you to have a little control pad to somehow manipulate it. And I guess as a storyteller who writes old-fashioned narratives with print, I'm wondering, what is my role as the creator? Is it just to set up a kind of interactive environment that other people can create stories within? Or is there a sort of boundary to my story world that is still relying on me as an artist?
Well, when I was reading your book, I'm from Mississippi, and
my book,
amazing book.
We have a couple extras. So.
Yeah. When I was reading it, I was probably a third of the way in, and I'm like, this guy loves Faulkner. This guy, he loves Faulkner, and he has to. And I don't know if that's true.
It's true.
But I could see. I grew up in a little town in Mississippi, and I never read Faulkner, even though I was a really good English student, because everyone there was so impressed. He had won the big prize, and they sort of intimidated me. Oh, it's so complicated, you know. So I was in graduate school when I was dating a guy that said, you know, couldn't believe I hadn't read Faulkner, and gave me a copy of The Sound and Fury, and I read it. And I'm like, what is the big deal? This is the way everybody I know talks. This, you start a story, and then you go down to 20 different paths, and you know, now in New York they tell me, okay, you're chasing another bunny, you know, come back. But it was, you know, that was in your book. And I'm reading, and of course, you know, what I didn't get with Faulkner, and which I love, is I get the drawings, and I get the thought process of the diagrams, and I don't want that to be lost. And I feel the same way about the art that is mosaic, just mosaic on the wall or sculpture. And I don't want to lose that. I don't think we will, but I'm worried more with like print media. How am I going to have that experience if they take that away? I mean, how am I going to feel that on a Kindle?
Yeah. Well, so I have two thoughts about this, and they were touched in my questions. I don't know if you guys have that handout, but there seems to be actually much more access to making art, right? To making design. Anyone with a computer can now write an opera, make a movie, you know, make a song, and like actually it's not that hard. You know, you can make it sound pretty good. So the question is, are we going to get a lot more great movies? Are we going to get a lot more operas? You know. Or does it still rely on being a great artist? And in the old system, you had to jump through all these hoops, right? If you were making a movie, you had to work with the Avid system, or if you were writing an opera, you had to go to, you know, so-and-so school and write everything on the piano and write it all out in hand. And I wonder if those gates kept away the masses. You know, that's one question. And the other question, which I don't have an answer to, and I think it's an ongoing question. I have a brother who's 10 years younger than me, and he's at least one generation younger than me, maybe two. I don't know. I don't know generations these days. I don't know how you define it anymore. But his entire existence, growing up, has relied on reporting everything online. That for him, when something happens, it's synonymous with a kind of reportage, and not only a reportage, but people commenting on it. That there's a collective meaning making that goes on that's deeply hardwired into a certain generation below a certain age. That in order for them to understand an experience, they need to put it up for public view and then to have people sort of reify that view. And it's not just like, oh, you know, for me, if I put something up like pictures, I'm like, this is cool. Other people want to see it. No, for them, it's much different. It's like that thing did not happen until other people have confirmed that it happened.
Right,
you know?
right.
And this manifests in a deep way in terms of understanding of creativity. You know, that they're much more comfortable with a sort of collective authorship. You know, and it manifests in all kinds of ways. This goes back to the whole notion of sampling. You know, for a lot of people, songs aren't just written; they come from sources, and you have your producer who makes the beats, and you sample this, which comes from a 1960s soul song, and then you have your co-writer, and this is not a problem. You know, it's like we all come together. We're all sort of, you know, we're probably sharing ideas across the internet. We maybe have set up a Tumblr where we kind of like put pre-ideas up, and this is amazing to me. I think it's you know, you see it on the ground, on the street level in Occupy Wall Street with people's comfort with the human megaphone. For me, that was like, man, that would be frustrating. But it seems like people were just like, yeah, you take something, you repeat it. Like that's how it works. You know, you say something, I say it louder. You know, that's like an extension of Twitter. You know, so what happens to that? What happens to Faulkner's, you know, Yoknapatawpha County if we're all sort of collectively creating it? I think great things. I mean, I don't want to be the naysayer that's like, we need one author, but it scares the shit out of me in some ways as like the author who's like writing the next book, and I'm like, you know, Will they be like, we need this to be a little bit more like a video game, or
Yeah, I think there'll always be room. I think there'll always be the place. I think it's a lonely place. I don't think it's the edgy, cool thing, but I think that independent vision where the artist comes out, creates, writes, with pen in hand, and that vision comes through. I know that it's the entire technology thing and what we're doing is this conflicting thing of not wanting to be behind, not wanting to be left behind, not wanting to be a part of any time but this time. And yet I have realities. I have realities that if I put technology there, chances are it will be outdated before the 3 years in which we get it built. Who's going to maintain it? And it's not just our environment. I mean, it's, we have probably one of the most complex, difficult environments to maintain because we never close, we never stop. But at the same time, there's a responsibility that what you invest to create, to put there, is going to be there 50 years from now and will need very little maintenance. Well, that's not part of this society that you're talking about this process. So there's the challenge. I think we've seen, how do you create the experience that is contemporary? How do you create the art that speaks to this time? And yet you make it durable for 5 years from now, for 10 years from now. If I get to come back in another life, I want to go see that work and see it's still there. And so it really is a challenge to the artist to say, and they're doing it. I mean, I think I'm very privileged to be able to work with so many really smart artists that are doing it with very basic materials. I think of the Starn Studio, Starn Twins project at South Ferry. Now, their work, their photography in the gallery, and they had only, prior to working with us, they had only ever worked alone with their studio. And so they're photographers, those of you that may not be so familiar, but they build their cameras often, they investigate nature. They did a series where they photographed snowflakes, where they'd run out, wait till it snowed, got the snowflake on a plate, take it back in with this giant camera, and they photographed snowflakes. A lot of their work are trees or synapses.
They did Big Bamboo.
Yeah, Big Bamboo, right.
Yeah.
And so they did this subway. They'd never done a public art project. Number one, they're extremely introverted, shy guys. And they were able to work with the team, with the fabricator, and to really create the feeling. They're often photographed, their works are translated often produced on handmade papers. And they were able to create that in glass in a process that had never been done before, and yet in the basic, simple materials of glass. And in other areas, it was mosaic and cut aluminum. But out of that project, and they learned that it was the first time they saw their work with the engineers having input and all the different teams, the Arts for Transit team, and everyone having a piece of this. During the middle of it, they got this idea. They said they rented a space up at Beacon, and they got the idea for Big Bamboo, and it grew out of the South Ferry project. So those are the things that I hope we keep our imagination open, that the things we can't do that embrace technology, but we take it as a challenge. The president of New York City Transit's a guy named Tom Prendergast, a great guy. And if you're often, transit is really challenged to do something that they don't have the resources for, and they need it tomorrow. And we don't do anything in onesies and twosies. We're hundreds and thousands, and you have to produce all this stuff. And he'll have everybody together, and inevitably he'll start talking about Apollo 13, when they put the guys in the room, the engineers, and said, here is everything that you have to work with to save them. And he will inspire everyone in that room saying, guys, give me the list of what you've got to accomplish this, and then come back and tell me how you're going to accomplish it. I love that story because I think it's what we do so many times when we're working with artists. And our job is to say, here's the tools. Here's what you have. Here are your parameters. Now go be brilliant.
Yeah.
Go do it.
I mean, I feel like your role as sort of this curator of this huge transit system where you have X amount of million people moving through it, stopping, going off, is a larger metaphor of how we are increasingly going to consume art, and any sort of creative impulse. I mean, it's how we move through cyberspace, and the challenge of given these constraints, given these people moving across this space, and how do we create something unique and pull them in and want them to stay here and have that moment like I had with that woman where I was reading a book, I was in my own head, and then I looked up at her, and then we both look up together at this animation. I mean, how often do we seek out those moments, right? Where our interior space somehow synchronizes with the exterior space, and then we have this transcendental moment where it comes back to it somehow bridges the interior and the exterior. I mean, essentially that's what you're trying to do, right? It's to create people who are moving to have a moment where they stop and think, I'm in a place, I'm in a space, here is where I am in my own creative thinking, and here is where I am in New York, and here is where I am in 14th Street, and how do all these things intersect? And here's where this artist was, but this is how we function. This is how, at least I think of, I don't like it, but how I read these days is as if I'm passing through a subway station, I'll read the first 2 paragraphs and then decide very quickly whether it's worth reading the other thing because I've got 14 other articles lined up, And it's rare that I'll be like, I'm clearing this afternoon just to stay in this subway station / novel, Like, who does that anymore?
Yeah.
Because we're moving, we got places to go. And so I think the question of, as an artist, whether you're a musician, whether you're a writer, whether you're a filmmaker, whether you're creating advertisements, whether you're writing operas, the challenge of how do we get people to stop for however amount of time we have for them and create something transcendental, create something meaningful, is becoming more of what your job is. Someone who's in transit, because now we're always in transit creatively, how do we create that moment? And I don't know, part of me is like, oh God, we're just shooting for the 5-second epiphany, where they're on the way from DeKalb to Manhattan.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I come from a place of reflection where it is great to carve out a week to read Moby Dick, but maybe that doesn't exist anymore.
I think, the sort of the premise, the philosophy that we built this collection was to really, just like in 1904, Hines and Lafarge were the architects. It was built by engineers, designed by engineers, and they hired architects, the same architects for St. John the Divine, and the ecclesiastical mostly, and the Bronx Zoo. And they hired them to really do the ornamentation, give us the finishes, design the finishes. We've designed these forms, you design the finishes. And they based it just as they did at the Bronx Zoo. They would use the elephants were carved on the outside of the elephant house. At Columbus Circle, they brought the caravel. The monument had been there at that point, 1900 when it was designed, 1902. And so they brought the caravel down into the terracotta, which would be later fabricated by Gruby, which was quite fantastic. And at each station, either in sometimes the numbers, but often with a pictorial image about what was above. For example, the beavers at Astor Place referenced the Astor family and their fur trading past. And so they grounded it in place by what was above, and that image very literally into the ornamentation. It was very clear to us when we came along that both in material and durability, what had lasted for 100 years were ceramics and mosaics, but also that the work should speak to the place it is. And I think that's been the sort of grounding factor and the factor that I hope makes people want to stop. I mean, I always say, I know when we did good, when someone comes along and they go, ah, and they want to touch it and reach out. And you can, it's a Roy Lichtenstein. That one's above, so you can't reach it. But Elizabeth Murray, you can reach out and touch. What a silhouette. And so you really are grounding. You have one philosophy that you give every artist. When you're bringing in a lot of artists initially, and you're going to bring it down to 3 or 4, and you're going to talk with those 3 or 4, and they're going to come back and give you proposals. Well, you're always trying to, particularly the ones that haven't done a lot of public art, and this is a new experience, you talk about, speak to the people that are here. That's been the one consistent thing we've said. Now, we don't mean that has to be literal. We don't think it literally has to be like in 1904 and reflect what's above. But it should be grounded. It's not about your work. You're in a public sector now. Who are you creating this for? And what do you have to say to them? And so the way that has played itself out in so many times, I hope does. I mean, I can't say we always do it. I can't say every artist always does it. But I hope that many of the experiences are doing what you say. And I think it's always the challenge to say, stop, read this, look at this, think about it. Particularly it's important when some people go through 2 subway stations mostly their entire life. They get up, they go to work, they get on the subway, they go to their job, they get off, they come back. The weekends they drive or they walk, or, so those 2 stations, it's, really nice if they have some interesting things that you can see more than once and you can experience. And often the desire is to layer it. So it is like you're unfolding, you're reading.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I'm working on a new novel right now, and this one was like a joy to write. I think I often hear this about your first experience. Maybe it's the first experience being a public artist, where you sort of don't know what you're doing, so you charge ahead with a blissful ignorance. And then it's the second time around where you know so much more of what you don't know that you start hitting these roadblocks. And I think a lot about, like, what is my job as a writer? Is it to ease people into the story and create a sort of escapism where they can just sort of lie back and be like, this makes total sense to me. It's not my life, but I love it, Or is it to make them uncomfortable, to hook them in, to first give them that, where they're like, oh, I have to keep reading. But then they start to grow a little uncomfortable, and and then they finish the book, and they're like, what was this all about, I mean, these are the questions that artists go through, right, as you're struggling with how clear is my message, how opaque is my message, where does meaning come through? And I think about this. I mean, I thought about this just the other day when I got on the subway at Prince Street, and there's those little people who are all kinds of people who are shopping or rummaging through trash, and I started comparing. Okay, I saw that person up there, and how is this person different? And I was creating stories. I was saying, oh, that person's much different because that person, that little, it's just silhouettes, is much more desperate than the person I saw up there because, he had a Starbucks in his hand as he was going through the trash, and what does that mean? And I hope that the future of here's my fear is that as we lose traction with our consumers, as a writer, as I know the statistics of books going down, and I know the amount of free time that people read, that my work is going to be affected. So that I'm like, well, I can't throw out something more challenging because God bless the reader if they take any time to read anything. And they're probably reading on an iPad now, and now they're probably surfing, the internet, and they're probably checking their email. Will that affect the way that I write? Will that affect the question of what artists that you bring? Will you bring something challenging and that takes time for people to move through it? As you know the expectations of your audience. I feel like my audience as readers is moving more towards your audience of commuters. They have a couple minutes at the subway station. They're going to go someplace else. Does that affect the music that we write? Does that affect the novels that we write? Are we seeing our novels shrink? I don't know. This is what keeps me up at night, I suppose.
Well, I have to tell you a little bit about that project at Prince Street. What's interesting is the title is Carrying On. And it's about what people were carrying up and down Broadway. Mm. So, often the manager at the time would go, Erica Behrens, and she would go and meet there with the artist in the station and talk about the station and how it's going to work and everything. And so the project came in, and we're looking at the drawings and everything, and they worked from photographs. They worked from photographs that they took of people carrying things along Broadway. And we looked, and there was Erica with this great big portfolio. And they had actually designed the manager into the project without knowing that she was bringing the portfolio of their work to meet with them in the station. And that portfolio, so your challenge is to go to Prince Street and find Erica. But anyway, they are more complex. The challenge, I'm struggling as an administrator with some of the same things, almost exactly the same things. And what I'm trying to do is, how this work should be of this time, and it should reflect the artists that are out there now. And yet, so much of the work now is addressing and composed of many of the things you're talking about. I don't have the answer. What I'm trying to do is to look to our staff that's often younger, somewhat younger, and to hear what work is responding, what they're responding to. I think you saw it. You might have seen the Wall Street Journal article a couple weeks ago that talked about Second Avenue and Sarah C's work. And I think Sarah's a real good example. She's opening next week at the Asia Society, if any of you around. Her work is a really good example. We're going to have to work in the materials of the station, which are going to be very large ceramic tiles that are part of a modular system. But the imagery is very swirling. It's very different. It's throughout the entire station on the mezzanine and as you enter. And I think, it's not technology in the sense of the material and how it's executed. But I think it's probably one of the first pieces that in the experience, you feel like you're twirling, I think you will, whirling and around, and it's sort of the profusion of all the things, all the stuff around you. And I think it's going to capture this time in it, and that was her challenge. Yeah. We could be, I could have made the choice to say, no, it has to be so literal, it has to be this, and we have to understand it all. A lot of it is going out there with the sort of faith that it'll come through, that the artist knows what they're doing, and that it's going to speak to you of this time, but it's going to, I'm more worried that it speak to your children and your children's children that are going to be using the Second Avenue subway.
So just the Second Avenue subway ties into something that I've been thinking a lot about, storytelling. Because for me, I've heard about the Second Avenue subway so much. It's like, it's this sort of like mythical Shangri-La. I picture like, sort of gondola boats, and when it comes, it's probably going to be a letdown because it's like, yeah, it's part of the New York subway system. It's not in fact a canal. Guided by Oompa Loompas. But that act of imagination, that act of like what's just beyond, is really what we are as storytellers. Whatever your medium is, that's where you want to position yourself. Is like whatever the Second Avenue subway is. Just before it opens, when we all have these expectations. As a storyteller, I really like my currency is the unsaid, what you can just almost imagine but is not quite explained, And I mean, it's why I think novels function well, which is that they're bounded. They have a cover, and I give you just enough to imagine a whole world, and then I cut you off,
You sure did.
And it forces you to figure out what the rest of the world is. And when you finish that novel, you're like, oh man, that ending just left me wanting more, and then you talk about with your wife, and that's how you connect the world of the book to the world of you. And I wonder how we will continue to be able to leave that wanting feeling in the future. As our mediums shift towards places where there's like an infinite comment section, you know, which can be a good thing and can be such a terrible thing, you know. If you ever want to like be pretty sure that we're all idiots, just read any sort of comment section on the internet, you know. You're like, oh, good God, you did not, you know. And like it always gets into these sort of flame-throwing back and forth, being like, well, I did not say that. You know, it's like people like get really ticked off about their diction, and you're like, no, that's people. That's not the large, you know. It's like, so I think anonymity is like this big problem of how do we engage with something, but then we put our personal feelings out there, and I think that, and this is it's where public art and novels really intersect. It's where our professions are. It's the great book, the great piece of art engages you for that wonderful brilliance, you know, whatever it is. Maybe it's 5 seconds, maybe it's 25 seconds, maybe it's 5 minutes, maybe it's 2 weeks or however long it takes you, and then it's done. And you're hungry for more, and you're trying to figure out what you just saw. I just was at the Venice Biennale, and I saw Christian Marclay's video installation called The Clock, which was playing in New York last September, and it's now playing in Boston. It's an incredible piece of work. It's 24 hours long. I didn't stay for 24 hours, but I stayed for much longer than I thought I would. It's basically, he must have had a team of 100 people looking through the history of film, not just American, but Japanese and obscure, weird monster movies, any reference to time. So if someone looked at their watch, or if there was a watch in the clock in the background, or someone said, you know, 12:15, like we got to go for whatever it is, and just strung those moments together beautifully. The editing was just divine, and you would think, okay, that's clever. You know, 24 hours. It's played so that if it's 11:15 in real time, it's 11:15 in the movie. Oh, that's clever, but it's captivating, and people stay there for hours without meaning to. And I was like looking at around, like, why are we all here? Because, you know, someone will answer a phone, and then the phone will ring in a different movie, a different time, and it will also be 12:15 in that movie in that time. And I think it's that gesture of anticipation, you know, that gesture that something momentous is going to happen, even though we know that something probably won't happen. And I think that's what great art does, you know, that when we see something, we're like, oh, we're witnessing the divine, you know. And then we return to our lives, we return to whatever we're doing. We read a couple pages of the book. Maybe we encounter a sentence that we underline, and we're like, man, that changes things. And then we go back to toasting our toast, you know. But how do we get? I'm worried, as you can probably tell, that moments of inflection will be somehow diluted, and it's up to us to make them not diluted, you know. I don't know. That's our mantle as creative people, is to say, you know, fuck no, we're going to make it happen. You know, we're given our discipline, given the impediments to us, given the Twitter sphere, they still need us. You know.
They do still need us. They need us a lot, and particularly when the challenges are so great, you know, to make a difference. And you know, the beauty of it is when they're so great. You know, I think about it a lot. You know, today we were talking about a little bit about the topic, and you know, you think about it. What was it like when they decided to build a subway? I mean, to think about it, you're in New York. Why did they build the subway? Because it was traffic, the population, horses, all the problems. But they didn't think about building it just where we were populated. If you look at some of the early pictures, say in the Bronx, they're just fields. You know, they're not houses, they're not, that would all come. But they had this imagination, this vision, the ability to visualize it, that you could do that. And you know, you're constantly torn, just as you talk about, you step away and you deal with the toaster, you're constantly torn between trying to imagine how you can impact Second Avenue subway, the number 7. and how you can get the floor clean when people are moving through it 24 hours a day and not always picking up their stuff, not always. How do you balance those things?
Yeah.
And the thing is, you cannot let the fact that it isn't pristine, it isn't perfect, stop you for dreaming what it could be.